Hi, welcome back to the podcast, HOA Hell. I'm your host, Michael Kushner, and with me, as always, is Senior Associate from MBK Chapman, Sam Kill. Sam,
Hello.
Good morning again.
Good morning. Good to be back.
Well, Sam, we're here for part two
of
our two-part episode on California's balcony law, SB 326. And last time, in part one, we talked about the mechanics of the law, specifically Civil Code 5551, who was allowed to do the inspection for an HOA, how often do they have to be done, and what is being inspected, okay? And those are the big factors that were discussed. And today we're going to go into the meat of the matter, and that is, okay, what has happened since the passage of the balcony law, and especially the passage of the inspection deadline over a year ago, that has resulted in hordes and hordes of massive special assessments in thousands of HOAs through the state of California. And when we talk about massive special assessments, we're not talking about $5,000 or $10,000. We're talking about 30, 40, 50 and even more, depending on the size of the HOA in question. In a lot of cases, those massive 30, 40, 50,000 or more $1,000 special assessments per household are impossible for some people to pay, if you're on a fixed income.
Exactly.
Or you're living, paycheck to paycheck and you can afford your place, but you couldn't afford to absorb an unexpected hit like that, which is kind of a car.
Yeah, especially the cost of living, gas, everything else going on.
And just being in California. So we think it's important enough to talk about, even though we do have an episode, one of our earliest episodes ever about this. We're going to touch on it specifically today. So today we're going to follow the money because that's what people are really interested in. And more importantly, in addition to describing the money, is we're going to answer a question that a lot of homeowners have asked us, and will probably continue to ask us, which is there a way that I can make our HOA pay for this in terms of the insurance or something, as opposed to it coming out of my pocket because this is ridiculous. And we're going to actually cover that today, okay? So let's first start with why is this bill so big? Why are these special assessments so massive? Massive to the point where they're making news. I mean, they are just huge. They are huge. When I see a homeowner come to us, 300 people, let's say, in their community, each being assessed $50,000, pay up, you have 90 days kind of thing. It's shocking.
Many are blindsided by it. I mean, no expectation of it, and you're going to get into this, Mike, I know from our discussions, but years and years of neglect, no prior notice, and then all of a sudden this wave of
they get a letter.
So-called, in many cases, emergency special assessments are thrusted on them.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah, we'll get to that. So when the balcony-related special assessments have been landing, and we've seen this over the last few years, as the inspection deadline was coming up, we started seeing it for the HOAs who were gearing up to actually comply. And then we've seen it since as well. So over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen this upward trend. And it's just so frequent now. These special assessments are happening everywhere, all over the state. Coastal communities, central or land, interior. What do you call that?
Inland.
Thank you. Inland communities. We're seeing them everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
Different things are causing different problems, but a lot of them are coastal because of the dry rot. But the point is, we're just seeing this all over the state. It's happening in rich areas. It's happening in poor areas. It's happening in middle class areas. It's happening everywhere. And it's not the law's fault. This was an important law, to be honest. I think this law was a great law. It wasn't the law's fault. It's the HOA's fault. And that's what we're going to get into today. So why are these things so huge dollar amount? And the shorter answer it really is that these special assessments are occurring for one reason, and that is years and years of deferred maintenance, period. Now, we'll talk about a few reasons behind the deferred maintenance, which are important, but that's what it amounts to. Years and years of deferred maintenance. Why is deferred maintenance a problem, Sam? Give me an example, a real life example, using wood and dry rot.
Okay.
Dry rot, not watt.
So here's an example. So one of the fundamental duties of a board is to maintain, repair, and replace common area components. These certainly fall within that purview. And if you regularly maintain and or repair Meaning, in the case of dry or wood or wood rot, as we're discussing, if you were to simply paint it or water seal it regularly,
like you're supposed to, by the way, on the reserve studies.
Notwithstanding SB 326, and that's one of those kind of more common sense standard things that the board could have done, should be doing, a good board should be doing on an ongoing basis. And if you do that, that extends a lifespan. It actually prevents damage and wood rot.
It is. That's what paint. Exterior paint is a sealant. Okay, when you don't see dry rot infecting pieces of wood that have been regularly painted and kept up. You see dry rot affecting wood that has been allowed to weather, where the paint and the sealant protection is gone, and dry rot sets in. Now, if you try to paint over that, you haven't fixed anything. You've just made it look nice.
You're keeping moisture out. You arguably keep.
That's what we're talking about, folks. So the failure to maintain and repair over years, not months, years, sometimes decades, is the cause of these special assessments. That's it. That's one cause, okay? Now, there are a lot of components to failure to maintain. Why aren't they maintaining? Why aren't they repairing? Well, you have lots of HOAs who think they're doing everybody a favor by not raising sufficient general dues every year to keep up with cost of living and to keep up with general maintenance. The reserves are supposed to be used for the big ticket items and the components, but regular maintenance is supposed to be coming out of the yearly budget. And that budget is funded by your regular assessments. And regular assessments need to cover what has to be done. And if it's not enough, the HOA has a fiduciary duty to increase it to the extent of the loss so they can cover the day in and day out maintenance and repairs that every single common area component requires. Just like you have to maintain the things in your house or your condo, so does the board have to do that with the common areas. When they don't do that because they don't want to raise dues, they are breaching their fiduciary duties. They're not helping anybody. They're just kicking the can down the road so that it becomes a serious situation financially instead of being handled over time in little increments. Another thing is everything has a useful life. We talked about this in our 2-part reserve study episode, and we are going to put a link in the description to that episode. I urge everybody listening to this episode to go and watch that because you'll learn more in that than almost any other episode we've ever done. It's extremely important. But that useful life is extended. You don't get the maximum useful life if you fail to do any maintenance. Right. The maintenance, it's assumed you're going to do the basics, the minimums. If you do those minimum basics, you paint your wood fixtures every few years, then you get the full useful life of that component. If you don't, you won't. It's that simple. And HOAs that abandon that duty because they're either too stupid or too cheap. And these are individual board members who just don't care, don't understand, and don't want to understand. They are not doing anybody a favor. They are hurting you, they're hurting themselves, and they're hurting every other homeowner in that HOA. But that's what we're talking about. So we see reserve studies that have been, by bad HOA boards, have been intentionally manipulated. Okay, fraudulently manipulated to get that percent funded number up, to maybe by delisting certain components or by extending useful lives without any justification. Because remember, in our episode, we talked about the fact that the professionals that do the reserve studies, if things are being handled carefully, or the HOA is taking great care to take care of things, or you had a particularly dry year, they might extend the useful life by a couple of years because the normal damage they expect to see wasn't done. But there's no excuse for board members to be doing that, and yet we see that.
Right.
That's fraud. That's when you see this sort of thing happen. For whatever reason, though, when these reserve studies are manipulated, when HOAs refuse to raise general dues because they want to keep those dues lower, is what causes all that deferred maintenance. Exactly. And then it starts to, it's like a snowball. Rolling down a loosely, a hill with fresh snow on it, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it develops a life of its own, and then it's out of control and everybody's screwed. I'm not going to reteach the whole reserve issue today. I'm going to leave it at that. I, again, urge you guys to go watch that 2-part episode. It's probably among the most important episodes we've ever done.
Agreed.
But let's talk about the fact. The fact is that these balcony law related special assessments in thousands and thousands of HOAs across the state have been huge. Huge, I mean huge, that is, it's double-digit monies in terms of thousands of dollars. More than any special assessment should ever be, absent who could have ever foreseen that earthquake or fire. All right, we're talking about things, and by the way, all of this, completely preventable, completely foreseeable, because every single component that has a useful life, that useful life is based on thousands and tens of thousands of examples and pieces of data that these reserve people use. And so it's down to a science, folks. There's no excuse for this.
There's nothing novel about this from that perspective. Yeah.
Nothing. No. Okay. So you have you've got the huge balcony assessment. You've just gotten the letter from your HOA saying, unfortunately, our balcony inspector said that we've got some, emergency situations here, and we need to embark on this multi-million-dollar repair cost because of our obligations under the law, and look how responsible we are, and we don't have the money in our reserve budget to afford this, so we're going to assess everybody $30,000. You get that letter, okay? Well, is that legal? Well, it depends. Okay, depends. 5605, the Civil Code, covers special assessments. When can a board unilaterally decide to specially assess? And when does a board need to go to the membership? Talk to me about 5605.
5605 provides a critical threshold in terms of what portion of the budget may the board pass kind of sua sponte unilaterally without a membership vote when it comes to special assessments. And that threshold is 5%. If it's 5% or less, the board can simply go
5% of what?
Of the annual gross budget.
For that budget, year's budget. The gross budgeted items. All right. Correct. So 5%, if it passes that, and that's total. So let's say you have 100 homes and it's a $10 million thing. You can do the math. I'm not gonna. But if it hits 5% of that,
it's not per home.
No, it's not per home.
It's in the aggregate. The cumulative amount has to be 5% or less. If it exceeds 5%, the board cannot unilaterally pass it. We'll talk about the exception in a moment, but they would have to go to the membership for a membership vote before they can pass
an actual election vote with secret ballots. And if you're in electronic balloting or electronic voting and balloting like we talked about, you'd have to follow those rules. If you're like most HOAs still using paper ballots, it's the whole kit and caboodle with the whole notice and the election timeline. All that stuff is in effect, and it's a yes or no to this special assessment. Now, you mentioned that there's an exception. There is an emergency exception. We're going to talk about that in one moment. So if the special assessment, the total for the repairs, $12 million, let's say, is more than 5% of the gross budgeted items from that year's budget, okay, then they have to go to you guys, the membership, for a secret ballot permission to do that. If it's less, then they can unilaterally decide as a board to impose that special assessment. Now, I don't think I've ever seen a $30,000 per household special assessment that was less than 5%. So I'm going to assume that doesn't happen for now.
Never seen it, yeah.
At least for the purpose of our conversation. If it's that big, there needed to be an election, and you would probably remember whether or not there was such a vote, because you would have likely gotten ballots for that. So you can ask yourself whether or not there was the proper election on that. Okay? Now let's talk about the exception. Because... And of course, by the way, I've done fact sheets on special assessments and the notice period on that. I will leave a link in the description for a couple of those. Go ahead and check that out. We've also got episodes on that in the past. There are notice requirements timely. Check those. Check those for yourself. He just said Civil Code 5615. He's correct. You got a 30 days, no less than 30, but no more than 60-day notice for the special assessment. Look that up, read about it. You'll get that on your own, okay? But it's the emergency dodge that I want everybody to watch for, because that is what a lot of bad HOAs are using. And what that is there is an exception built into the special assessment law that we were just talking about that allows a board to disregard the 5% requirement, you need to get a vote requirement, and pass it if it fills one of the three emergencies that's listed in the statute. And the reason bad HOAs have gravitated to this dodge is because they are misusing it. How are they misusing it? Very simple. The bad HOAs who have breached their fiduciary duties by underfunding reserves, by fraudulently manipulating reserves, by refusing to raise assessments to cover just basic day-to-day maintenance on these components, have breached a multitude of duties they have to everybody and to your HOA itself by failing to do the basic minimums of their jobs. That's what the breach of fiduciary duty is. And they try to cover up those breaches and that fraud to the extent that they're one of the ones that's actually manipulated reserve studies. They use the emergency situation to cover it up. And so you can't allow that. But here's what that statute says. There are 3 situations which qualify under the emergency exception, which would allow a board to disregard the 5% rule. And what are the 3 exceptions?
1, by way of a court order. So a court compels that you take certain action, and that's immediacy. 2,
and we're not going to talk about that today, right, because let's just pretend there's no court order here.
The second exception is if it implies or affects essentially a health and safety issue,
right,
which we alluded to in episode 1, 2, where let's say a building is red tagged and it's on the verge of collapse, right, or structural.
Not a building, but like a balcony or a walkway.
Or a triple E, exterior elevated element, is on the verge of, let's say, it being compromised. And 3 is if that issue or that structural element that presents a concern was not reasonably foreseeable to the board.
Right. So if the issue in play here wasn't reasonably foreseeable to the board when they passed the budget,
exactly,
then it covers. So you've got 3, one of which we're going to disregard. The court order one, we'll set that aside. But that second one, that health and safety implication, or was it reasonably foreseeable? Now, I can see an actual conflict occurring. Let's say you have a bad HOA that has fraudulently manipulated your reserves, that has done all sorts of bad things, right? And they're trying to cover up their wrongdoing by getting this thing passed under the emergency exception so they don't have to talk about it in an open meeting, okay? Let's say they do that. And obviously, if that's the case, they can't possibly pass that third mm-hmm. exception because it was completely foreseeable.
Right.
Okay. But if in fact the balcony or the railing or the walkway is now a danger, it does clearly pass under the second one, and they can impose that assessment on everybody. But they're not safe for doing it, because here's the remedy for that. You go after that board member or that board, you go after whoever's responsible for that fraud or whatever was done wrong, and you go after them for the breach of fiduciary duty, the gross negligence. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's now an emergency, and because of that, you can assess us without the vote, and it has to be taken care of. Mm-hmm. Life trumps everything else. We get that. But you need to pay the piper now, okay? That's when you go after that board. That's when you sue that board for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty and other causes of action, because they allowed this to get to the point where it is health and safety, immediate health and safety threat. It should never have gotten there. It should have been budgeted for over the course of the last 10 or 20 years. It should have, regular maintenance, regular painting, regular repair should have been done so this never happened. And by the time it got to a point, well before it became a danger, it should have been replaced. Mm-hmm. Because the whole point of reserves are not to pay for ongoing daily repairs. That's not what reserves are for. The reserves are to pay for common area components when it's time to pay for them, so that if something has a life of 20 years, that by the time that 20 years is up, there is enough money in reserves for that component to be repaired or replaced. That's what's supposed to happen.
Right.
It doesn't. And a lot of times, the lower your percent funded number, the lower chance it is that you've got money set aside for anything. Mm-hmm. That's a fact. Again, watch that 2-part episode that we talked about. But that emergency situation has to be done so the board can use their emergency powers, but they should be held liable for it being there in the first place. Mm-hmm. And that's where you get to this next part. So, and by the way, under Civil Code 5610 is where we're going to find those emergency exceptions.
Right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not just a matter of the board meeting and saying, emergency, mm-hmm. What do they have to do?
Well, they have to.
What if they put on the record?
They have to get a resolution on the record. They have to deliberate, and the proper way to do it is that you essentially present the basis for it. You have a deliberation by the board. There's an emergency meeting, and then you have a resolution adopting to pass.
They have to adopt an actual accused corporate resolution mm-hmm. that states a written finding as to why they're invoking the emergency assessment, under what of the three factors that they're using, and why it falls under that factor. So if they're relying on the health and safety, it's because we were just told that this thing's going to collapse and people are going to die. So that's the why, and it's also the what. You're relying on number two. Right. Okay? You have to put that in the open meeting minutes. It has to be in the record. Okay? They have to make that written determination, that finding. Okay? Now, deferred maintenance is not is the opposite of unforeseeable, but it doesn't mean it won't hit that second one, just to make that clear. Right. Okay? You also want to look to see whether or not the board is actually, in what they list as the emergency. Let's say they're using that one. Is it really an emergency? Were they told this thing is dangerous, or were they told this is getting to be in bad shape? You want to look at it in the next couple of years. Because if you have a couple of years, it does not fall under number two. Number two is immediate risk to health and safety. 2 years from now, 3 years from now, that's not immediate risk. That's just a serious problem. Right. Okay? So it's got to actually fall under it. Hence, their obligation to describe the basis. So hold them to that. Now, you also want to look for something called lumping. And we talked about this. I talked about this in one of my fact sheets that I wrote on special assessments, specifically how bad HOA boards abuse the emergency exception. And I'll put a link to that specific fact sheet in the description. And what I called it in my article, I called it lumping. And that is, boards look at you remember what lumping is? Yeah. Tell me about lumping.
Well, lumping is, let's say, under the guise of an emergency assessment, special assessment in this case, as we were discussing, they will weave in or lump in or incorporate a whole bunch of other additional items.
They'd like.
Other projects, pet projects, let's say that a board member cares about, landscaping or this or that, repainting something completely unrelated to the railings and exterior elevated elements, that they use the health and safety exception as a pretext, essentially, to get that passed.
So let's say the repairs to the exterior elevated element that's actually, let's say we're using the number two exception, which is health and safety, and it relates to the balconies, okay? Yeah. And let's say the balcony repair is $3 million. And that you divide that by however many households there are, and there's the amount of your special assessment. But let's say it's $3 million, but the special assessment's for $3,180,000, and $180,000 is really going to cover fixing some of the, there's some broken sprinkler systems or landscaping, and they're going to fix that at the same time. Okay, no, that's called lumping. You can't do that. The emergency exception is for the emergency only, not 1 penny more. They cannot emergency assess you 1 cent more than is necessary to fix whatever's at issue for the emergency.
And just to be clear, that other portion of it, there may be a legitimate need or use for it, but that should have been budgeted for under the normal budget. And if not, then it should go under the standard ballot process.
Pull it out of the reserves that they already have, because they can use the reserves for any kind of repairs they want, or pull it out of or do a separate special assessment a different year. Because remember. Let's say you have a $3 million here, and you have let's say your HOA has a couple thousand units, and you're actually under that 5%, but you add something else on it, it can bring it up, right? Because it's cumulative, right, for every year. So it might be perfectly valid that landscaping or water, the water feature has to be fixed, just not under that emergency exception. Don't allow the lumping, okay? Now, here's the problem you didn't see coming, and reason why these are very big deals. Aside from the fact that homeowners are being asked to write very, very large checks, which can really not just put a damper on vacation plans or being able to pay for their children's college education or whatever. Sometimes it's, I have to sell the house because I don't have the money to live here anymore. I can't afford this. I can't afford it. And that creates a big problem, and that leads to this next issue, is selling the house, let's say, okay? So this is the second injury. It's called a secondary injury that you don't normally foresee or see connected with the balcony law or with a special assessment, because it's not directly related, but it is a direct result of exactly what we're talking about. And that is, if things are bad enough, you might not be able to sell your house at all. And I'm not just talking about California's disclosure requirements, which are intense and make it very hard to sell for what you think fair market value is. People aren't going to want to buy into a community that is currently facing a $40,000 assessment. But if they are, they're going to make you eat that, and they're going to say, okay, take that off the price of the house, right? They're going to one way or another, you're going to end up paying for that. Okay. So I'm not even talking about that part where just by virtue of your disclosure obligations will just make it that much harder to sell in a competitive market. I'm talking about something that comes out of left field, and that is Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac delisting. We've talked about this in other podcast episodes, and I've written extensively. Again, I will put some links in the description. This show is going to have a whole bunch of links in the description for everybody because I want to just put it all in there for you guys to have a one-stop shop, okay? But this delisting thing is massive, and here's what it is. And we're talking about conforming loans, okay, not jumbos.
Right.
But most condominiums fall into conforming loan numbers, okay? So if your HOA, if your community, your HOA community is delisted by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, you aren't going to be able, the government will no longer fund or back those loans, which means that you're not getting any conventional buyer, you're going to get cash payers only. Because if somebody can't get a loan, and they're not going to get a loan if it's not backed by Fannie Mae. So if the buyer isn't able to secure a backed loan, then you're not going to get people coming in that have the ability to borrow and pay for your property through that. And that is the vast majority of sales. Very few of us actually pay cash for our houses. We get mortgages. Well, you're not going to be able to sell if nobody can get a mortgage because your community's been delisted by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac.
Right.
And there's two ways that this could delist you. Number one, massive elemental failures to structural components is itself a factor that would cause a delisting. And if there's a massive special assessment, a lot of people are delinquent because they just can't afford to pay.
Yeah.
If it hits
the
above
default
that
rate going up,
15% number, that's another reason. But really, it's the actual structural defects itself is enough to get it delisted. Now, delisting is not permanent; it's temporary. As soon as the repairs occur and your HOA reapplies or notifies Fannie Mae and they come and do an inspection, you can get listed again. But while your HOA community is delisted, you are not going to sell your property to anybody except a cash buyer. It's just not going to happen because Fannie Mae will no longer back the loan, and that means banks aren't going to issue the loan. It's that simple. Okay. Number two, insurance.
Oh yeah.
What are some insurance companies doing now when it comes to EEEs?
Well, we're
talking about condos here, by the way.
They're excluding, they're non-renewing, premiums are going up.
Yeah. If they're still covering, premiums are skyrocketing. What your master policy, your HOA's master policy might have, let's say, for coverage of these exterior elevated elements might have cost, $20,000 for that part of the coverage might now cost $75 or $80 for the same thing. So some HOAs just can't afford it and they're dropping it.
Yeah.
Some insurance companies are simply saying, we're no longer insuring EEEs in California. We'll give you this insurance and this insurance, but we're not doing that. That's a massive problem for every single person that lives in that community because if there's no insurance, who's paying? Tell me, Sam, who's paying?
Homeowner.
You.
Yeah.
You, the viewer. You and all your fellow neighbors and every one of those directors is paying. Everybody. Okay? So you've got delisting by Fannie Mae. You've got insurance companies either refusing to cover or pulling out entirely, or HOAs not being able to afford it. And you've got, I think that's bad enough. I don't have to go any further. That's bad enough. Yeah. Okay? Now, I already said this, it's good news. It's not permanent.
Right.
Okay? The insurance thing might be, but the delisting isn't. The delisting is not permanent. Just fix the problem and get it done. That's a lot easier said than done. I'm not making light of that. Now the big question. Let's move on. I don't want to pay out of my pocket. Is there a way to have the HOA's insurance, malpractice insurance pay for this? In other words, their D&O. How do we make the HOA cover this without assessing us? Now, that's a big ask, folks, because there's only two ways an HOA could cover something. You or the insurance company. So the only way this goes by is if it's covered under the insurance policy. So what is it we're talking about? Well, we've talked about these years of deferred maintenance, right? If you can show the breach of fiduciary duty and the deferred maintenance, if you can show all that, it should be covered. Now, there might be reservation of rights because breach of fiduciary duty might not be covered. Gross negligence should be, okay? that dividing line, what would happen if every one of these HOAs in California that's facing these massive assessments, by the way, in my opinion, absent a disaster or like a massive earthquake or a huge firestorm that destroys these things and causes these special assessments, if it's caused by deferred maintenance, which all of this is, then by definition, every one of these is a result of gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. That's my conclusion, having seen thousands of these and heard about thousands of these. I can't think of a situation where, absent a disaster, there was a non-negligent or non-breach of fiduciary duty cause of a special assessment in the $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 per household range. I haven't run into one. It is always, from what I've seen every single solitary time, it's a result. If you go back, you're going to see nobody cared about this. Nobody budgeted for it. Nobody maintained. Nobody painted. They didn't do anything. They just year after year after year, they screwed with the reserves or a combination of all of it. That's what you're going to see. In my opinion, insurance should cover, to the extent that an HOA has coverage, it should cover every one of those. Everybody in that situation should be suing their HOA. Now, that would cause a disaster, but it's what the law says.
That's a good point. I mean, even pre-SB 326, these components are actual components that are covered in the reserve studies, or at least should be. The HOA boards are entrusted with routinely inspecting these and making sure that they're safe. And so a lot of those components—
just being maintained, even not safe, just maintained.
Now codified and articulated under SB 326 and the related statutes, that is something that pre-existed in many ways, except for it was not legally imposed or enforced by an external agency.
And here's the thing. What I was just suggesting is a very big deal. It's a very, 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 very big deal. Okay, because you're looking at tens of thousands of lawsuits across the state.
Yeah.
It could be problematic. It could bankrupt insurance companies. But guess what, guys? That's what the insurance policies are for. This should be covered. Homeowners should not be on the hook for any of this. And there should be consequences for boards that allowed this, and board members. If there were any spearheaders, they should be held responsible. We've seen many examples, not all, but many examples where individuals on the board are actually responsible, and they should be held liable. Corporations Code 7231, business judgment rule. Does business judgment rule protect gross negligence? No. Does it protect breach of fiduciary duty? No. Okay? Failure to repair and failure to maintain are not business judgment rule protected activities. They are abuses of authority. They are a failure to do bare minimum that an HOA is supposed to do. One of the main three purposes of an HOA is to take care of, maintain, repair, replace the common area. That's their job, and they didn't do it. And now they're coming to you for money. Well, I say no. I say enough's enough.
Those situations are especially flagrant when you have, even with prior boards, pre-SB 326, if you've had consultants, in those cases, pre-SB 326,
who told you?
They didn't need to be licensed architects or licensed civil
Could
or
be contractor.
Anyone. If they put you on notice or put prior boards on notice, hey, you have this issue, or you have a shortened timeline to address these issues before it becomes a massive problem.
These balconies are starting to develop dry rot.
The joist, whatever.
Yeah.
Right. And so if those boards and successor boards fail to act
or ignored them,
notwithstanding SB 326, it's to your point.
Setting balcony law aside, if you can pull documents from the past where these reports existed and we had contractors coming in and saying there's dry rot here and nobody did anything about it, that's a massive problem. Okay, that is a big deal. There's no business judgment rule for that. Okay, so you have this big assessment. You've got your letter. Assessment's illegal in the sense that it either falls under a proper emergency or there was an election and it passed. What do you do? Well, because you want to check to see that. First thing you do is you demand records under 5200, right? Do the math on the assessment. Make sure that if it's above the 5% figure, that there was an election or that there's an on-the-record stated emergency and it's been documented, because like it has to be through that resolution. And then if you feel that it's a result, you've found evidence in the reserve studies or in reports from other professionals that, hey, you guys have to repair this and nothing was done. If you think there's gross negligence here, if you think that this is a result of fiduciary breaches, then you might make a demand on the board. And if that doesn't go anywhere, you might ask for IDR. at least put them on notice. At least you get their arguments for that, okay? You meet with them. And if that doesn't work, that's when you come to us. I mean, the point is, there's a lot of people that have come to us, and we have filed lots of lawsuits because of these systemic failures that have caused these poor people to suddenly face these horrific special assessments. And by the way, we're talking about condominiums and townhomes here, because this isn't really going to affect single-family homes, because they don't have exterior elevated elements that are common area. It's kind of not how they work.
Right.
I think you got through episode 1 and episode 2, you've got your whole picture here on SB 326. Certainly with the amount of data and the amount of material that I'm going to leave in the description, you're going to have a game plan. Regardless of what your specific HOA situation is, you'll find an answer somewhere in there. If you like this episode, please hit the like button. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our channel, HOA Hell. If you want to leave a comment or ask a question, please do so. Until next time, have a wonderful day.